Lisa Williams. I'm a clinical social worker, and I am the co-founder of What's Your Grief, which is one of the country's largest online grief and bereavement support organizations. We've been around since 2012, and we really work with people who are experiencing all types of grief and loss, both death and non-death losses. And my background coming into this work, beyond being a clinical social worker, I had been working in the field first of medical and bioethics. I have a background in philosophy and ethics as well, and had worked with families who were making difficult end-of-life decisions, and really spent a lot of time working with folks at the hospital in circumstances of both expected and unexpected deaths. And we, in the work that I did, I'm based in Baltimore. I was working with a colleague who I ultimately founded What's Your Grief with. And we were working with families who had lost people to traumatic and unexpected causes. So usually homicides, suicides, overdoses, accidents, and strokes tended to be who we were working with. And we found in that work that there were so many challenges to accessing grief support, that there were many people who just did not have the time to be able to access services. They didn't necessarily have insurance coverage for mental health support. They didn't have childcare. And then there were just a large number of people who really weren't interested in traditional counseling and traditional support groups. That wasn't something that worked well for them, or in other cases, sometimes they felt like there was stigma attached to accessing those sorts of things. And so really where my career has evolved over time has been in doing work helping people to understand what grief support looks like in non-traditional mental health formats. There's a lot of great research that shows us that there are so many ways to be able to process grief and deal with death and non-death losses other than just those paths of counseling and support groups. But unfortunately, a lot of times people don't know how to access those things. They don't know what those alternatives are. They're not sure how to do those things at home. So my work now really centers around helping people with that through What's Your Grief, primarily in the online space, though a little bit in person here in Baltimore. So What's Your Grief? We are an online community space where we do a lot of different things. I think because we are big believers that there is no one way to cope with grief, we put a lot out into the world to kind of tap into different things. So for people who are really looking to learn more about grief, we started first and foremost really as an educational and support website where we have hundreds of articles about all things grief and loss that you could ever imagine. And with that, we have a grief podcast as well, where we kind of talk for those folks who would rather listen than talk. And we then have a lot of creative expression projects that are really to give you ideas if you know that you are a little bit more creative or more active in your grief, but you don't know what that looks like. We have a photo grief project and online courses, online journaling courses, exploring grief through photography courses, art journaling for grieving courses. We have a grief recipes project where people can submit their kind of their recipes that are connected to people who are gone and how they tap into that in their grief. Grief secrets project where people can share their anonymous grief secrets and just realize that so many people are carrying secrets in their grief that they feel so ashamed about. And so many other people are carrying the same secrets, and a lot of times it's just that we're not putting those things out into the world. So we have a number of, and some other creative expression projects. So, a lot of things where you can kind of tap into different ideas and ways to use creativity. And then we have an online community, which is a place where we do regular, not really traditional support groups. We do more like learning online workshops and webinars. We have libraries of recordings of those. We do creative expression projects there. We do guided journaling there. And there's a forum where you can connect more in depth online, with other people in your grief. And so we love that space. And we also have a space for grief and mental health professionals who are want to learn more about grief. Unfortunately, Most people can go through a master's and PhD program in counseling, social work, psychology, all forms of mental health, and never be required to take a class in grief and loss, which is unsettling when you consider that almost everyone will experience grief at some point. So we provide continuing education for clinicians. And from that, we had more and more clinicians who just said, I really want to connect with other people who specialize in grief. I want to learn more, do ongoing learning, have a place to cope with my personal grief in the professional context. So we really, it's a support community for mental health and grief professionals just to be able to connect online and do ongoing learning. And I think that's most, and we have a book. We have a book called What's Your Grief? List to help you with any loss, which is really a book that is geared, there's so many great grief books out there. So when we wrote it, we thought, like, do we really need to add another book to the library? But one thing we felt like was there really weren't books that we felt like were good for instrumental grievers, for those people who were kind of a little bit more on that cognitive and active end of the spectrum, wanting to learn more about grief. And so we wrote a book that we felt like really is, I hope, good for all grievers, but especially might resonate with some of those instrumental grievers who couldn't always find books that were ideal for them. And it's also written in a format that we felt like was really digestible. The big feedback we always receive from people when they found our website and our social media would be like, I bought all these grief books and my attention span was shot. I couldn't concentrate. I couldn't remember anything. And what was so helpful about your website and your social media was you had really helpful information, but it was in these digestible, short kind of articles. And that was just what I could take in. And so that's really how we formatted the book. It's written so you don't have to read it from beginning to end. You can hop around just to the places that are relevant. It's I have ADHD, so I always say it's kind of ADHD friendly, which happens to be kind of grief friendly for when your concentration and attention and memory aren't always what they used to be. So yeah, all those, and it's at whatsyourgrief.com or at whatsyourgrief on social media.
What kind of information would you like to share with listeners as far as what you've learned through the work that you've done, that maybe like the needs that people need the most often, or the advice that's given that seems to support and help other people the best?
I think in working with people, one of the things that's so challenging is that in grief, people's needs are so incredibly different. People grieve very, very differently. Unfortunately, there have been these very outdated ideas about grief that society has absorbed, like the idea that there are 5 stages of grief and things like that, that really don't align with most people's experiences. They weren't even developed around grief. It was actually developed around death and dying. But many people have come to believe that what their grief will look like is something predictable, universal, that it'll fit into these nice, tidy little boxes. And often people around them believe the same thing. They think that people are going to go through these stages and they're going to get to acceptance and go back to normal or go back to being who they were before. And what we know is that for most people, after profound and significant losses, they feel like they'll never go back to being exactly the person who they were before this loss. And that grief in some ways stays with them forever, in the sense that our grief is just our normal and natural reaction to loss. And that loss, that's always there. So we learn to carry those losses differently with time. We learn to be able to find the support that we need, the tools that help us, the skills to be able to just exist in the world after a loss. But what those things are is very, very different for each individual person. And so one of the things that is so important and that we know is for people to be able to come to their grief with a real openness to knowing that it might not look like their family members, their friends. It might not look like the way they expected it to look. It might not even look like it looked in the past when they grieved other losses. Because with each loss, we are grieving that unique relationship with that particular person. It's different with each loss that we go through. So it's really important to kind of come with that openness and not judge ourselves and not judge each other. to be able to understand that that variability is normal, to also know that grief is not something that kind of gets a little bit better every day until it's gone. Often people think we somehow recover from grief like we recover from a cold, like it's just, and we know that grief, it's not linear. It can have those feelings of 5 steps forward, 3 steps backwards. People will sometimes feel like they have been doing really well and then say, I have had a terrible week. Maybe I hadn't been doing as well as I thought, or maybe I didn't really process that loss as much as I thought I had. Rather than understanding that there's always going to be bad weeks and stressors in our lives and triggers in the world that bring that up, it doesn't mean that we didn't cope with it properly in the past. It often just means that there are these ups and downs that come with grief. So one of the things I think when we're looking at, what advice do you give people when there is so much variability, is if someone is grieving themselves, to really tap into what are the things that you've leaned on in the past in other difficult situations in your life, even if it hasn't been something as severe as a death. To know that, if you love creativity, if that's always been a big part of your life, tap into creativity as a tool. If you are somebody where, running has always been the place where you found solace and you de-stress and things like that, then that might be something where you realize getting back into a real running routine is something that's really meditative and comforting for you in your grief. Knowing that you can kind of test out different things to see what's working, but don't feel limited by the idea that it has to come through a support group or that it has to come through journaling, and just kind of staying open to all of those things. I think the other big thing that we know is figuring out how you want to keep a connection with a person who's died. I think many times, unfortunately, society has a lot of discomfort with our ongoing connections with people who we've lost. There are still these messages people get that, like, after a year, I should be over it and shouldn't be talking about it anymore. But the research really clearly shows us that it is completely normal and natural for people to develop what we call continued bonds with people who've died, and that those continued bonds often, they change shape with time. They may look different after 10 years than they did at 10 months, but that oftentimes we use those connections as a way to feel comfort in the world as we go forward, as we are still trying to figure out how to navigate life without that person, imagining the advice that they might have given us, traveling to a place that we know that they loved, or a place that they always wanted to go, or making the foods they used to make. Like, all of those continued connections are something that really help us in our grief over the long term. And so feeling comfortable with that, knowing that it's completely normal to be doing those things, to think about what are the connections that you want to be able to kind of continue with the person who's died, and how do you surround yourself with people who, if you do want to share memories together, or kind of keep that connection going, or feel like you want to be able to talk about it with people, figuring out who are the people in your life who are comfortable with that. And knowing that there's always going to be some people who may not be comfortable with it. That's okay. They may be wonderful supports to you in other ways. But finding the people who are comfortable with that can really go a long way in your grief.
Thank you so much. That was really helpful. That was new stuff that I had ever heard before too, that continued connection. I never heard that before, but that's really comforting to think about. Like you said, so many people think they just have to, I feel like, in order to get over a person who has passed, like, cut them out. And
Yeah,
when you think about that, that's kind of traumatic to do as a way of trying to cope, so.
it makes grief, I think, so much harder for people. If people are feeling like what I'm supposed to be doing in my grief is like putting my loved one in the past and disconnecting from them, it makes it really hard to think about moving forward. And I think when people are able to shift that and go, no, this person left this imprint on me that is always going to be here, and I get to decide now what pieces of that imprint do I want to lean into? And, people leave imprints on us that aren't great too. Like sometimes a death can actually allow us a space to be able to say, some imprints I'm going to like relinquish a little bit. I do want to maybe get some distance from some of those things, but I'm able to make those decisions, and that's what I'll be able to take with me in the future.
Love that. Any
Yeah.
aha moments that you've learned along the way as you're doing your groups and kind of talking with people that, that would be good to pass along and share with others?
Yeah, I think that probably, I think one of the things that is an aha moment for a lot of people, and that I've experienced in my own personal loss and also working with so many people, is just how much of grieving someone can start before a person dies, for so many reasons. Right now, we're obviously living in a world where a lot of the population is aging. Alzheimer's and dementia rates are really soaring. And there are so many people who have had that experience of feeling like they're slowly losing a person over time because that person is just no longer who they used to be. It can happen when somebody in our life has a substance use disorder and we feel like they are here, but they're not here. They're not the person they used to be before they started using, or that the person that they are when they're sober. And so we're grieving that relationship we used to have with that person. And so oftentimes creating that space, and I think to be able to know that that is grief. Grief is not our reaction to a death. It's our normal, natural response to a loss. And we lose pieces of our relationship with people. We lose pieces of people for many different reasons other than just death. And so I think oftentimes I find that when I'm working with people, and sometimes they say, oh, there's actually a word for that. They call it ambiguous grief. People have this feeling of like relief because they're like, yes, I feel like it's grief, but I felt like I wasn't allowed to call it that because I felt like grief was just for when someone dies. But oftentimes that also shapes the way we grieve after a death. It can look really different when we have been grieving someone for many years, sometimes before that death happens. Sometimes because we think that all that grief before a death will mean that it'll somehow be easier after the death. And that it's different than when it was unexpected, but it's not necessarily easier in the way sometimes people expect. But also just that sometimes there is a lot of what we have been our relationship, and when it's changed, maybe because we were a caretaker, or because of something where we really had distance from that person, that oftentimes we are then going back after the loss to pieces of our relationship from many years ago because we had been so in it with the addiction or with the caregiving or the mental health issue that we almost hadn't fully been able to process some of those losses. So it can be complicated, but I think that's one thing that I always like to reassure people and remind people, because it is such a big part of many people's grief.
So what are some of the coping skills, I guess, or ways to process grief that I know you said it's different for every person, which I understand, but what are some of the ways that maybe would highlight for people watching this that are some things maybe someone didn't think about that may be going through a loss that might help them process through it?
Yeah, so I think oftentimes when we think about how we process grief, people go right to think about talking. And talking can be great. It can be really helpful to be able to connect with a counselor or talk with friends and family, talk in a support group. So we always encourage you, if those things work, to definitely tap into them. I think the other big one, of course, that people go to, that people will think about, is journaling. One of the things that we always encourage people with journaling to consider is that sometimes free journaling in grief, it can be hard. People, especially if you're not already a journaler, people like don't really know where to start, or they feel like they're just kind of going over and rewriting the same things again and again, and not really feeling like the journaling is productive in the way that they'd want it to be. There's value in getting our thoughts out, even if it doesn't feel productive, right? Your journaling doesn't have to be getting to some sort of endpoint. And that being said, sometimes prompts and guided journaling can be especially helpful in grief, because it does give you a little bit more direction to be able to think about, okay, what is it that I am? If we use these vague terms in mental health, like processing, like what does that really mean? What am I really trying to work through, right? So is it complicated emotions that we have? Is it, really digging in and being present with some of those emotions that might be hard, like guilt and regret and anger and blame and self-blame? And, those are some of the common stuck points that people will encounter in their grief, where they just start to really ruminate and struggle with some of those feelings. So that journaling and those guided prompts can sometimes help you to say, oh, wait, am I stuck on some of these really complex emotions where I can't get past this guilt. I can't figure out how to show myself self-compassion or self-forgiveness, or show that to another person. So sometimes that can help. It can also give more guided for memories, right? Some of the coping and processing we do is we have this fear that we are going to lose our memories, that's going to be this secondary loss, that as time passes, we won't be able to remember what their voice sounded like, or we won't be able to, remember memories that were important. So sometimes journaling can be a great way to document some of those memories for yourself, to be able to feel like, okay, I've done this, I've written this down, I can come back to this, I can revisit this in certain ways. And it can help to clarify things about our support system. One of the huge coping skills that is so important is to figure out how to build a good support system in grief. And we know that sometimes people really feel let down by other people in their lives. They feel like people didn't show up for them the way they wanted them to. People ghosted them or avoided them, or people said the wrong things. And oftentimes, part of it is just we have a lot of discomfort with difficult emotions. Like grief is hard. Grief is not easy for anybody. People don't know what to say. They're worried that they're going to make you more upset. And even though that is irrational, it comes from a place often of wanting to be able to make the situation better and not knowing how to do that. And so sometimes what's important is being able to think about who have been the people who've really shown up for me. Who are some of the people who I know love me and are well-intentioned, but have been missing the mark? And can I give them a little bit of feedback? Can I maybe do some writing about the feelings that have come up, and then find some ways to actually talk to them about it, so that I don't just write them off because they maybe put their foot in their mouth a couple times or haven't checked in as much as I wish that they had. Journaling can also let us remember, around people, the strength of the people around us. All people can't be all things to us. And so there are going to be those people in our support system who are going to be the shoulder to cry on. And there are going to be those people who they can't be that for you, but they are great at dragging your butt out of the house and getting you to laugh and have fun and be distracted and, do those things that are a really important part of our grief too. And so sometimes, guided prompts, guided journaling can help us to do that in more systematic ways that can actually help us with building our support system. And during those guided prompts, I always tell people, if they're not into writing or journaling, any sort of guided prompts, you can use them with any other outlet you want. So, lots of people will use those and those same prompts and use photography. We use, art journaling or scrapbooking or collaging, drawing, writing music, creating playlists where they're connecting with other music, about certain emotions, that maybe that helps them to really tap in to their own emotions. So just giving yourself permission to say, when I'm processing some of these emotions or memories or different things, there's no one way. It doesn't have to be through writing or through language. It might be through this other type of artistic expression. It might be through action. We know in grieving styles and coping styles in the research, there are intuitive grievers and instrumental grievers. And it's kind of a spectrum. It's not like one or the other, but intuitive grievers tend to be more of what society imagines grief to look like, which is people who are really tuned into their emotions. They're often expressing their emotions outwardly, if not in language, but they may cry. They may be a little bit more interested in connecting with other people and talking about their grief. They find value in shared experiences with others. And they are really, I think, what mental health designed grief support for. The coping stuff that's out there is often kind of geared towards those intuitive grievers. But on the other side, we have instrumental grievers, and instrumental grievers tend to be more cognitive in their grief. So when they're talking about their grief, they're going to be more likely to describe their thoughts rather than their feelings. And so in those folks, what we see is they tend to experience their grief in more physical ways. They tend to get less benefit from connecting with other people and talking about their grief or their emotions, and instead tend to like doing things and being a little more active in their grief. So with this, sometimes people will think that instrumental grievers are avoiding their grief because it doesn't look like what they expect it to look like, because they're not talking about their feelings. They're not necessarily crying. They are sometimes very ready to start planning a memorial golf tournament for next year in memory of the person, or they want to, rebuild the person's car that they were working on and never finished, or something that feels like a very kind of active way of connecting with the person's memory. And sometimes in those times, that's actually when they're processing some of their emotions through thought, doing things that are for them, a little more meditative. Maybe it is that person who goes out for a run and they use that time to feel like they're either connecting with memories or trying to cope with some of those difficult emotions of figuring out how can they be a little more self-compassionate or whatever that is. So being able to look at yourself and go, okay, wherever I am on the spectrum, that's normal. And other people in my life, it's normal if they're at a different place on the spectrum. Neither has been shown to be, a healthier way to grieve. It isn't that one group or the other does better in their grief. It's just their different ways of kind of being in the world around our grief. So being open to either, knowing that for both groups, sometimes learning about grief is really helpful, especially instrumental grievers sometimes really like to learn about, okay, if it's not the 5 stages of grief, what is it? What are the other grief theories that are out there? How do I make sense of some of these things that are happening to me? That can actually be a huge, way of coping and quite comforting for some people in their grief, is just to understand it a bit more. And then connecting with other people, if it's right for you, is something that we encourage people to really think outside of the box. It doesn't just have to be support groups. We do know that loss can be so isolating. There's a lot of loneliness that can happen. And it doesn't have to be just going to a support group. There are many, many more groups now than there used to be even on like meetup.com that are just groups of, you'll see like widow groups where they're just going all to a concert or going to go hiking or going to go on a cruise or whatever, where it's not about talking about grief per se. It's just about being around other people who have also experienced loss. And if you are feeling lonely, sometimes, especially if you've lost a partner who you did a lot of things with and you're not comfortable doing stuff out on your own, being able to find ways to get comfortable with groups, and sometimes a group of other people grieving is a great place to start. And then also online, there's lots of great ways to connect with other people online in all sorts of different spaces, on social media, on in forums and online communities. So just if you're a person who likes to connect, to look for all the different ways that you might be able to connect.
When you talked about some of the myths, so when we think about grief, like you mentioned, the 5 stages of grief kind of being a little bit more of a myth that people believe. Are there any other myths out there that people still sometimes hold on to, and maybe tying that into like helpful versus unhelpful ways to try to support somebody or help somebody who is grieving?
Yeah, I think one of the big myths that exists still to some degree, with some people at least, is this like myth about keeping busy. Like it's that you just need to keep yourself busy. You need to distract yourself, and it's interesting because there's like so many things. There's a spectrum, right? Like we don't want people to be holed up inside forever, not doing anything, and just kind of stuck in the darkness of their own grief. And also keeping busy and avoiding your grief and avoiding the difficult feelings isn't actually helping us to learn how to carry those really hard emotions, to know that they're going to stay with us. There's always going to be hard days. Part of it is that act of grieving that is, I mean, we say this a lot, right? You don't need to heal from grief. Grief is the healing, right? The grieving is what is helping you to learn how to be in the world with these difficult emotions that are always going to come up sometimes and sting in the future. And to know that you're going to be okay, that you are going to be able to manage those emotions and still be able to exist in the world and be connected to the person who died. But we do need to take time to take care of ourselves in early grief. And that does mean slowing down a little bit. It does mean saying that I need to maybe just figure out where I am now, get my bearings in the world again, figure out what my purpose and my values are. Like those aren't small things. After a loss, so many of those things are destabilized. Keeping busy isn't usually going to be the thing that helps us to kind of reconnect with who we are and figuring out who we are in the world going forward. So I think being able to give yourself, cut yourself some slack, give yourself some grace, whatever that is, to say it makes sense that I'm not just back to normal doing all my volunteer activities and working all the time and doing all those things. I need that space. And there's George Bonanno is an interesting, he's a researcher. He does a lot of research around grief, also anxiety and different things. But he talks about sadness and kind of from an evolutionary perspective with emotions. We understand so many emotions serve purposes for us. And sadness is one that people struggle to say, like, why do we feel sad? Like, why do we have that feeling? And he talks about the idea that sadness does turn us inward. It slows us down and it helps us to sort of tend to ourselves. And sometimes people will say grief can make me feel a little bit selfish or self-absorbed, or, because I'm so connected with my own experience of what I'm going through. We eventually do need to turn back outward again. But I think it's important to say that turning inward, that slowing down, that cocooning, that in early grief is an important thing for us to do. And then not staying there forever is also important to figure out how we start to open back up again over time.
I know for myself, when I was going through a loss and someone said, like, I repeated, I guess, the words that I had heard before of, I should be better by now. I shouldn't be so upset still, and almost apologizing for it. And hearing someone say, it's okay, really helped me. Just hearing that, like you had said, like it's okay that you're still upset. It's okay that you're still crying. It's okay that it's been X amount of, days have passed and you still feel like you're struggling with this. So I think sometimes just hearing that it's okay. And now that I understand that sometimes people do say things that I think they mean well, but it's not as helpful. But I think it's that uncomfortableness too, where they just want to see you better. You know, they don't want to see you crying anymore. They don't want to see you upset anymore. They want to see you better. So they're just trying to push you along to get you out of that zone so they feel better too.
Well, and I think, right, it goes back to probably one of the deepest myths or misconceptions, not just about grief, but I think about human experience, which is this idea that what we should be doing at all times is trying to avoid difficult emotions and be happy, right? And that's, I think, such a misunderstanding of just what it means to be human. I think so many things in the world, like, they're not just about feeling happy all the time. Like, if they were, we would all just like do MDMA all the time. We don't, because we understand that sometimes, like, things that are really hard and challenging end up being really, really rewarding. And sometimes tapping into memories that are really painful and make you start to cry are also so comforting, and you feel so much gratitude that you have those memories. And there's so many things in life where it's not about just alleviating our suffering. I think that if we can understand that having well-being is knowing that we're able to hold the hardest emotions alongside of the good emotions, and we're not always trying to get away from the hard emotions, that is something that's so important. But unfortunately, I think, just as you described, other people often want to just rush us to this place where, like, I just want to see the happy stuff. I don't want to see any of this other stuff. I do think sometimes it can help when we remind people that we're happy where we are, right? We're not trying to rush to some other place to get to the other side of grief or the other side of this. We're taking things in the time and pace that work for us, and the sadness will always be there alongside of other things, especially when it comes to a death of somebody who is really important to us. I mean, you'll hear people sort of quip often, but it is really true. Like, you're still sad? Like, yeah, they're still dead. Like, that's always still going to be there. And it doesn't suddenly stop being sad. And it's important that we can say, yeah, it's always going to be sad, and my life is still going to have lots of other wonderful things, but I'm not trying to erase that sadness. I'm learning how to live with it.
And I think sometimes for me too, like, changing that perspective of, instead of getting so caught up for myself in like this loss that I had, I tried to change the perspective of, you know what, it's a gift that I loved so much that loss feels so great. When you're impacted, it's like, it's that gift, really, if you can reflect and think, okay, this really is a blessing because that person was so special to me, or whatever it may be that was a loss,
Yeah, of course. And I think being able to have that gratitude for the relationships or whatever it was that was so important, it helps so much. And it's not that sometimes people will be like, that's, but is that just toxic positivity, trying to look on the bright side and sugarcoat things and whatever? And I think the important thing is to go, well, no, it's not saying that gratitude erases the sadness. It's that they literally have to go together. Like, the reason the sadness is so big is because the love was so big, and I'm grateful for all of that, but it doesn't erase the sadness. It's still part of it. And I think that's the difference between that, toxic positivity where people are just saying, kind of, oh, well, look on the bright side, at least you can meet someone else, and at least they lived a long life, and these things that are just trying to minimize. I think being able to find the gratitude is saying we're not erasing anything else. We're just finding the gratitude where it exists.
Yeah. The other thing I think I learned about myself with the loss is, when the time came and I had to say goodbye, there was really this lack of trust in me that I would never feel that love again, So I had to really kind of realize that myself of, and I'm a very spiritual person. So I had to really kind of just go, okay, if God gave me this, he will give me something again. You know, I will have that love, that connection again. So it was just kind of like for me, like releasing that fear and having that trust that it will happen again. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that fear it's so deep within us, of that fear that we'll never feel this again. And I think one of the things that can be helpful to remember is like, we'll never have the exact relationship that we had with, whether it's a person or an animal or something. Like, it'll never be that. It won't like fill that same hole. That doesn't mean that it won't be able to be as great and as meaningful and as connected, and I think because that is, we don't replace people one for one or animals one for one. Something that we value just as much and that's just as amazing. It'll just take its own shape, because it always does.
is there anything else that you can think of that we haven't really talked much about, that, whether it be in like presentations that you've given, or, discussions you've had with people, that are just really good insights that we haven't really touched on yet?
I think the one other thing I would add that is helpful, or that can be important to think about or useful, is that oftentimes in grief, especially with the most severe losses, where we realize this is something that has disrupted so many different aspects of my life for so many different reasons. Oftentimes people will feel like there's kind of nothing left to hold on to. Like, I've lost everything. And they really can't figure out how do I even get out of bed in the morning? What's going to kind of get me going if there's nothing left to ground me or to moor me? And though this can feel kind of abstract when people first start connecting with it, one thing that we find is really helpful for people is to really think about what their values are. And sometimes the values that are important to them are things that were part of that relationship, right? Like, even thinking about whether it was a person or an animal, or what was part of that love that made it so great. Was about that person? Was it their compassion, or how curious and inquisitive they were about the world, or anything? Like, what were those things? What are things that always meant something to the two of you together, right? Was it creativity? Was it community and family? Like, what were some of those things? And trying to reground to some of those things, and to know that people will say, I can't imagine I'm ever going to feel happiness again, or joy again, or all of those things. And sometimes what we'll encourage people to do is, you can start small. You don't have to start there, right? If community has always been important to you, has there been a time since your loss that you've really felt a sense of community? Like, is that something that you can build more of? Or what were the places where you felt community before the loss happened? Can you dip your toe back into going to those places? If it is, things about them that you really loved and appreciated in their values, are those things that you want to try to create in the world now that they're gone, kind of in their memory and part of their legacy? And is that maybe a value that you can connect to, that starts to be a reason to get up out of bed tomorrow, right? And I think sometimes when we connect back with those values, we realize there are things that are still inside of us, that even though we might not feel them in the same way as we did before the loss, even though the grief sometimes feels like it puts this shadow and cloud over all of it, that sometimes they're a place to start in thinking about, where do we reconnect with the world again, and how do we find that motivation? And slowly but surely, people then often go, oh, wow, wait, I did really like laugh today for the first time, or I did really have a moment where I did feel inspired or joy, or some of these feelings that I couldn't imagine that I was ever going to feel again. But sometimes it starts with the small things. It's like, how do I just find a place where I can feel calm today if I haven't felt that? And rebuilding from there.
Awesome. Well, I love your heart and your passion to just continue to help others. So thank you for all that you're doing. And is there anything that keeps you going? Like, because this is such a heavy topic, I would think it could really be draining sometimes to kind of continue, doing what can be hard to do. So what kind of keeps you moving and your positivity to continue to kind of fill yourself up to keep going?
Yeah, I think people ask us this question a lot, and I actually, interestingly, I do to some degree think that people are all just built for different types of work, and I do feel like in some ways this is just work that as soon as I started doing it, it wasn't what I ever planned to do. I did, my dad died when I was a teenager, and then my sister's partner, who was like a member of our family, died when I was in my mid-20s, and I wasn't one of those people like some people who work in grief who are like, I went through losses and then I was called to do this work. That kind of was not my story at all. But once I started doing the work, I was just like, oh, this feels like where I'm supposed to be. So I think that is part of it, is that it's always just felt like a good fit for me. But I think the other piece is that somewhat counterintuitively, I think that in this work, I am so aware of that life is short and mortality and how much hard stuff there is in the world. And though I think that can sound like it must be just draining all the time, I think what it also does is it just makes me really grateful, kind of like you were saying earlier, right? It makes me really grateful for what I do have, and it makes me really motivated to take advantage of the opportunities and moments I have in life, to appreciate the big and the small things that are there. And I think that it's easy to forget that, in a lot of other jobs or a lot of other work that you do, it's easy to just get stuck in the day-to-day routine of things and forget how amazing and precious life is. And so I think that that is a big part of kind of what keeps me going in the work.
Beautiful. Well said. Well said. Well, again, thank you for everything. And even just when you were sharing your story about the loss of your dad and your sister's partner, just, it reminds me that, again, the things we go through, while we wish a lot of times we didn't have to go through them, they do make us different and they make us more equipped to do the work that we do. So I think that's kind of twisting it around. Maybe it's that positive, what did you call it? Toxic positivity. I never heard that, but I'm like, oh, that's probably me sometimes. Toxic positivity. But again, I think, if we can look at our struggles as a way of like, okay, this is going to make me different. This is going to make me be able to help somebody else in another way.
Absolutely. And I think, it isn't, I think for me, I know that I am a better person. I am a person and I am happier being, having been through those things. And it doesn't mean I'm grateful that they happened. It doesn't mean I wouldn't trade all of that self-betterment to have those people back in my life. Like, there is not a question. And I'm also able to say those things in my life made me a person who I think is a more empathetic, caring, appreciative, grateful person in the world. And so I don't think it's toxic positivity when we can say it's not trying to erase the bad stuff. It's trying to just be able to say that we can appreciate the good stuff alongside the bad stuff.